Langston Reed, a successful black CEO, returns to his hometown of Willow Ridge, only to find it plagued by systemic racism and corruption. The local sheriff, Grady Walker, and other powerful figures target Langston with racist harassment, unjust treatment, and biased legal actions. Langston faces constant microaggressions and overt discrimination from law enforcement, public officials, and even local businesses, forcing him to confront not only personal prejudice, but a deeply rooted corrupt system. As the town's racial biases grow more evident, Langston's battle for justice intensifies, challenging both his resilience and the very fabric of Willow Ridge's society. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, its golden rays splintering through the dusty windows of Millie's diner. The place had seen better days. Faded vinyl booths lined the walls, and a flickering neon sign outside barely hummed to life. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and overcooked bacon, a scent the locals called comforting. For them, Millie's wasn't just a diner, it was the heartbeat of the small, slow-moving town of Willow Ridge. At a corner table sat Langston Reed, a name that carried weight in corporate boardrooms and high-rise offices across the country. At 45, Langston was a powerhouse, the CEO of a multi-million-dollar renewable energy firm and a philanthropist who quietly funded community programs across the nation. On paper, he was one of the most influential men in America. His resume, a laundry list of achievements and accolades. But today, dressed in dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, and low-profile sneakers, Langston blended in. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here for something he rarely found in his fast-paced world: peace. He sipped his coffee, lukewarm and too strong, but he didn't complain. For someone whose life was scheduled to the second, there was a kind of charm in the slowness of Willow Ridge. This was where he had grown up, a town with just one stoplight and no more than 3,000 people, most of whom still remembered the Reed boy as the skinny kid who carried his books too close to his chest. Langston hadn't been back in years, not since his mother's funeral, but today, business brought him here, or rather, business combined with his need to reconnect. He was negotiating to build a solar power plant on the outskirts of town, a project that could create jobs and breathe life into the struggling economy. Still, he knew it wouldn't be easy. Old towns don't like new ideas, and Willow Ridge, like so many other places, carried its own ghosts. As Langston leaned back in his chair, scrolling through emails on his phone, the door jingled. He didn't look up, but the sudden shift in the diner's atmosphere was unmistakable. The low murmur of conversation dropped an octave, heads turned, and eyes lingered a little longer than usual. "Well, look who it is," a voice drawled, heavy with condescension. Langston glanced up and locked eyes with Sheriff Grady Walker, a stout man in his 50s, with a belly that strained against his tan uniform, and a mustache that hid most of his mouth. Grady had been a fixture in Willow Ridge for as long as Langston could remember. He was the type of man who thrived on familiarity and routine. People like Langston Reed outsiders, even if they'd grown up here. Grady approached the table slowly, his polished boots thudding against the worn linoleum floor. He stopped just close enough to tower over Langston, his thumbs hooked into his belt. A faint smirk curled the corner of his lips. "Didn't think you'd come back. Reed City life, treating you too good to remember where you came from?" Langston set his coffee cup down gently and looked up, his expression unreadable. "Afternoon, Sheriff. Didn't expect a welcome party." Grady chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just making sure everything's in order. Folks round here don't see much of your kind these days." Langston didn't flinch. Langston held Grady's gaze, his face calm, but his mind working overtime. It wasn't what Grady said that bothered him. He'd dealt with far sharper insults in boardrooms filled with old money. But the way he said it, with that air of smug superiority, as if his presence here was somehow unnatural. "Didn't realize my kind came with a schedule," Langston replied evenly, leaning back in his chair. "But I'll make sure to clear it with you next time." Grady's smirk faded, replaced with a flash of irritation. Around the diner, a few of the patrons exchanged glances, pretending not to watch, but clearly hanging on to every word. Langston could feel their stares like needles against his skin. Grady's hand shifted to adjust his belt, a small but deliberate gesture that carried an unspoken weight. "Folks here don't take kindly to people coming in and stirring up trouble." Langston didn't move. He wasn't about to let Grady bait him. I'm here to bring opportunities, not trouble, but I'll leave that to you, Sheriff." Before Grady could respond, the waitress appeared, clearly sensing the tension as she hovered nervously by the table. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, her voice brittle. Langston smiled softly, breaking the tension for a moment. "I'm good, thank you." The waitress nodded quickly and disappeared back behind the counter, where she whispered something to the cook. The low hum of conversation picked up again, but Langston knew the eyes hadn't left him. Grady seemed reluctant to leave, as if he'd been counting on Langston to react. When he didn't, the sheriff gave a mock smile. "Enjoy your coffee, Reed. Be careful who you trust round here. Not everyone appreciates outsiders telling us how to run things." Langston didn't reply as Grady turned and lumbered out of the diner, the door jangling behind him. The second he was gone, the room seemed to breathe again, but the tension lingered like a stain. Langston exhaled slowly and turned his attention back to his phone, pretending to focus on the emails in his inbox. Small towns never forget, he thought. His mother had told him that growing up, and time hadn't proven her wrong. He hadn't been here in years, but it was clear that for men like Grady, his success was less of an achievement and more of a betrayal. Minutes later, Langston paid his tab and left a generous tip on the table. He stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, slipping on his sunglasses as he walked toward his rental car parked down the block. He passed a few locals on the way, their gazes lingering just a second too long before they looked away. As he reached his car, he noticed a black pickup truck parked a few feet behind him. Leaning against the hood were two young men, local types, dressed in work boots and jeans that looked perpetually stained with grease. One of them, with a buzz cut and a tattoo crawling up his neck, spat on the pavement as Langston approached. "You lost?" the man called, his tone flat but challenging. Langston didn't break stride. "Not at all," he replied coolly, unlocking his car door. "Nice day, gentlemen." He didn't wait for a response. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes the best way to respond to hostility was to refuse to engage. As he slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, he caught the sound of their laughter through the glass, a sharp, mocking sound that cut deep. Driving away, Langston gripped the wheel tightly, his calm exterior giving way to a knot of frustration in his chest. This is why people leave, he thought bitterly. No matter how much he gave back, how much he achieved. For some people, he'd always be that boy from the south side of town. And now, his return to Willow Ridge was not only a personal test, but a professional one. He needed to secure the town's approval for the solar project. If he couldn't win them over, the deal would die, and a dozen opportunities would vanish with it. The next stop on his itinerary was a meeting with the town council. It was being held in an old courthouse downtown, a place that had seen generations of arguments, decisions, and, no doubt, injustices. As Langston walked up the stone steps, he caught sight of a woman in a smart blazer and pencil skirt, waiting for him by the entrance. "Mr. Reed," she called, her tone brisk but polite. It was Ava Whitman, the council's clerk, a no-nonsense woman who'd been handling the details of the project. Langston offered a polite nod as he approached. "Good to see you, Ava. Everything ready for today?" "Yes, but I should warn you," Ava said in a low voice, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "There's been some resistance to the project. People here aren't comfortable with change. You'll need to tread carefully." Langston smiled faintly. "I always tread carefully." Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was starkly formal. Polished wood benches, dull fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and a dais where the council members sat like judges presiding over a trial. Langston was led to a table at the front of the room, facing the council. A small crowd had gathered in the back, local business owners, farmers, and townsfolk, curious to see the man who'd come to change their lives. The council chair, a portly man with thinning gray hair named Harold Pritchard, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed, thank you for being here today." "My pleasure," Langston replied, his tone steady and professional. He clasped his hands together on the table in front of him, a habit he'd developed for these kinds of meetings. "You're proposing a solar plant to be built on farmland just south of town," Harold continued. "It's a bold idea, but some of our folks have concerns." Langston nodded. "I understand that change can feel uncertain, but this project could bring dozens of jobs, lower energy costs for the town, and create a sustainable future. I'm here to listen to your concerns and answer any questions." Before Harold could respond, a man seated on the council spoke up, a wiry farmer with a deep frown etched into his face. "Jobs for who?" he asked bluntly. "You bringing in your city friends to take over our land?" Langston turned toward him, unfazed. "We plan to hire locally as much as possible construction workers, maintenance crews." "Sure," the man interrupted, leaning back in his chair. "That's what they all say." The murmurs in the room grew louder. Langston kept his composure, but he could feel the hostility tightening like a noose. This wasn't just skepticism, it was distrust. Another council member chimed in, her voice sharp. "And what happens when the plant fails? We've seen companies like yours roll in with big promises and roll right back out, leaving us worse off." Langston met her gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to make empty promises. I grew up in this town. I know what it's like to feel overlooked, to see opportunities pass us by. That's why I came back." A scoff echoed from the crowd. Langston turned slightly and caught sight of Sheriff Grady Walker leaning against the back wall, arms crossed, watching him with an unmistakable smirk. The tension in the room was palpable. Langston could feel it clawing at him, daring him to react, but he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, he let his words settle, his confidence unshaken. "This isn't just business for me," Langston continued. "It's personal. I believe in this town, I believe in its people, and I'm willing to work with you to make this project a success." Silence hung heavy in the room. For a moment, Langston thought he saw a flicker of understanding on Harold's face. But before anyone could respond, Grady's voice rang out from the back of the room, loud and mocking. "Sounds like a sales pitch to me." Laughter rippled through the crowd, low and cruel. Langston's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn around. He knew better than to play into Grady's hand. Harold cleared his throat again, visibly uncomfortable. "We'll need some time to discuss this, Mr. Reed. We'll follow up." Langston nodded, though the meeting felt anything but promising. He gathered his papers, stood, and turned toward the exit, ignoring Grady's smug expression as he passed. Outside, the cool evening air hit him like a balm. Ava joined him a moment later, her face etched with concern. "That didn't go as well as I hoped." Langston offered a tight smile. "It's not over yet." But as he walked toward his car, Langston couldn't shake the weight pressing on his chest. For all his success, all his hard work, there were still places where his name, his face, and his intentions were enough to make him an enemy. And Willow Ridge was starting to feel like one of them. Langston leaned against his rental car, staring at the courthouse steps where the town council meeting had just taken place. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the streetlights buzzed to life, casting pools of dim light onto the cracked pavement. The weight of the meeting lingered, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. Tomorrow, he'd meet with several landowners, and his pitch would have to be flawless. Pulling out his phone, he checked his emails again. As he skimmed through his inbox, the sudden flash of headlights made him squint. A familiar black pickup truck rolled slowly down the street, its engine growling like an animal prowling for prey. Langston recognized the two men in the cab from earlier at the diner, buzz cut and grease stains. They weren't subtle. Their eyes locked on him as the truck slowed to a crawl. Langston ignored them and turned his focus back to his phone, but the truck didn't move on. Instead, it stopped. The men stepped out, boots hitting the pavement with deliberate heaviness. "Evening, city boy," Buzzcut called, his tone dripping with mock politeness. Langston didn't look up. "Evening." The other man snorted. "Look at him, too good to talk to us now. Guess all that city money makes you deaf." Langston forced a calm breath through his nose. "Gentlemen, if you're looking for trouble, I don't have time." Buzzcut's expression darkened as he stepped closer, towering over Langston with a cruel grin. "Funny? We're not the ones bringing trouble to this town." The other man chuckled, slapping the truck's hood. "Grady says you're here to take what's ours. You're just another suit who thinks he knows what's best for folks like us." Langston's patience thinned, but his voice remained steady. "I'm here to bring opportunities, not take anything from anyone." "Opportunity," Buzzcut sneered, leaning in. "Fancy word for stealing." Before Langston could reply, the shrill wail of a siren sliced through the air. A patrol car skidded into view, tires screeching as it stopped a few feet away. The door opened, and Officer Grady Walker stepped out, his face lit up with that same smug grin. "Well, well," Grady drawled, strolling toward them. "What's going on here?" Langston's jaw tightened. "Nothing at all, Sheriff. Just a misunderstanding." "Is that right?" Grady's gaze flicked to the two men. "You boys causing trouble?" "No trouble at all, Sheriff," Buzzcut replied smoothly, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Just having a chat with Mr. Reed here." Grady's eyes swung back to Langston. "Funny, because it looked like you were up to something. Reckon I should take a closer look." Langston stared at him, incredulous. "Oh, take a closer look at what, exactly?" Grady's smirk widened, and without warning, he grabbed Langston's arm. "Sir, I'm gonna need you to turn around and put your hands on the car." The air froze. "What?" Langston said sharply, jerking his arm away. "On what grounds?" Grady's tone hardened. "Obstruction of an investigation. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Buzzcut and his friend chuckled behind Grady, the sound like nails on glass. Langston's blood boiled, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew what this was: intimidation, pure and simple. But giving in to anger would only make things worse. "Sheriff, this is ridiculous," Langston said, his voice measured but firm. "You don't have any reason to—" Grady's hand shot to his holster. "You resisting, Reed?" The threat hung heavy in the air around them. The sleepy town had begun to take notice. Lights flickered on in windows, and a couple of locals stepped onto their porches, watching the scene unfold. Langston raised his hands slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. "I'm not resisting." "Then do as I say." Grady grabbed his arm again, spinning him around to face the car. Langston gritted his teeth as he felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around his wrists. His anger surged, a fire in his chest, but he bit it back. "Stay calm. Stay composed." "You're making a mistake," Langston said, his voice steady but low. Grady ignored him, pushing him roughly toward the patrol car. "We'll see about that." From behind, Langston heard Buzzcut's voice, mocking and triumphant. "Welcome back to Willow Ridge, sir." The holding cell smelled like sweat and stale air. Langston sat on the metal bench, his cuffed hands resting on his knees. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed loudly, but not loud enough to drown out his thoughts. He replayed the scene in his head over and over. Grady's smirk, the cuffs, the humiliating walk to the patrol car, as neighbors watched from their windows. His phone had been confiscated, and the silence was suffocating. Langston wasn't afraid, but the injustice of it all clawed at him. He'd worked his entire life to escape moments like this. Moments where his success, his money, none of it mattered. Moments where, to men like Grady, he was just another black man who didn't belong. The door creaked open, and a man entered. Mitchell Crawford, a lawyer and longtime family friend. Mitchell was in his early 50s, with silver hair and a crisp navy suit that looked slightly out of place in the tiny station. "Langston," Mitchell said, his voice low but steady. "Are you all right?" Langston stood, his eyes blazing. "I've been better." Mitchell glanced around the room, his jaw tightening. "Grady Walker called me, said you were interfering with an investigation. What exactly did you do?" "Exist." Langston's lips twitched humorlessly. "More or less." Mitchell shook his head. "It's a stunt Grady's been riding a thin line for years, but this is over the edge." Langston's voice dropped, his composure like iron. "I want this handled now." Mitchell nodded. "It's already in motion. I spoke to the mayor, and he's livid. You'll be out within the hour." Langston let out a slow breath, but the anger still simmered under his skin. "And Grady?" Mitchell hesitated. "We'll deal with him, but Langston, you need to tread carefully. This town—" He gestured vaguely, as though the very walls held the prejudice they both knew too well. "This town doesn't change overnight." Langston's gaze was unrelenting. "Then I'll make sure it does." An hour later, Langston stepped out of the station, his belongings returned, and his wrists sore where the cuffs had dug in. Mitchell walked beside him, his phone to his ear, already working damage control. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Curious locals and a few familiar faces. At the edge of the group stood Grady, arms crossed, watching Langston like a predator who thought he'd won. Langston met his gaze with a look that promised he hadn't. "Careful, Reed," Grady called, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "You're stepping on thin ice." Langston didn't stop walking. He didn't look back. Instead, he said quietly, "Thin ice breaks the hardest when you stand your ground." The drive back to his hotel was silent, the dark road stretching endlessly before him. Willow Ridge wasn't just a small town with outdated ideas, it was a system, one that protected men like Grady and kept men like Langston on the outside. As Langston parked in front of the hotel and stepped out of the car, his resolve hardened. He had spent decades building his name, his legacy. He'd survived corporate battles and systemic barriers that would have broken most men, and now, here he was again, forced to fight for dignity in a town that didn't believe he'd earned it. Langston pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The voice on the other end picked up immediately. "It's time," Langston said, his voice cold and deliberate. "I want every detail on Grady Walker's record, every report, every incident, whatever he's hiding. I want it on my desk by morning." He ended the call, staring out into the night. Grady thought he could humiliate him, beat him down, and walk away untouched. But Langston wasn't the boy they remembered from Willow Ridge. The fight had begun. Langston sat in the dim hotel room, staring at the glow of his laptop screen. It was nearly midnight, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. Mitchell's investigation into Grady Walker had yielded results faster than expected, and the files now staring back at him painted a damning picture. Unresolved complaints, allegations of misconduct swept under the rug, use of excessive force against Black and Latino residents. It was a pattern Langston knew all too well. Systemic rot covered up by small-town power and complacency. Grady Walker wasn't just a bully with a badge, he was a symptom of a deeper sickness. Langston leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. He'd faced adversity before, but this time, it felt different. Grady had humiliated him publicly, dragging him in handcuffs through a town he had once called home. He hadn't just attacked Langston as a man, he'd sent a message. "You don't belong here." A knock on the door pulled Langston from his thoughts. He checked the peephole. Mitchell. When Langston opened the door, Mitchell stepped inside quickly, holding a thick folder under his arm. "I found more," Mitchell said, his voice low. He tossed the folder onto the desk. "It's worse than I thought. Grady's been dirty for years, bribes from local businesses, favors for landowners, and a pattern of targeting anyone who challenges his authority. Half the town council looks the other way because they're in on it, and the other half is too scared to speak up." Langston flipped the folder open and scanned the pages. Photos of redacted police reports, notes from witnesses who later retracted their statements. It was a tangled web of corruption, and Grady was at its center. "This man shouldn't be wearing a badge," Langston said, his voice cold. Mitchell sighed, dragging a hand through his graying hair. "He shouldn't. But this is Willow Ridge, Langston. You know how it works. You try to call this out, and it's your word against his, and his word carries weight here." Langston's gaze snapped up, hard and unrelenting. "Then we make my word louder." Mitchell gave him a wary look. "What are you planning?" "I'm going to expose him, publicly. The solar project is tomorrow's headline, but Grady Walker's corruption will be the real story." Mitchell shook his head. "You'll make enemies. The council will come for you. The landowners, hell, half this town, will call you an outsider stirring up trouble." Langston stood, his expression resolute. "Then let them. This isn't just about Grady, it's about the people he's hurt. The people who are too afraid to stand up to him. If I don't fight back, what message does that send?" Mitchell stared at him for a long moment, before nodding, a reluctant but respectful acknowledgement. "All right, I'll make some calls. You'll need allies, and fast." The next morning, the town square buzzed with activity. The Willow Ridge Community Center had been chosen as the venue for Langston's presentation to landowners and business owners about the solar project. Rows of folding chairs had been set up inside, where the town's most prominent figures, along with several wary locals, had already begun gathering. Langston stood near the podium at the front, reviewing his notes. He wasn't just pitching a project, he was making a stand. The calm mask he wore belied the fire simmering inside him. Today wasn't just about the plant, it was about pushing back against the walls Grady Walker and his allies had built around this town. Mitchell entered, phone in hand. It's packed words out that you're addressing more than the solar project. People are curious. Langston gave a tight nod. Good. Let them hear the truth. From the back of the room, Sheriff Grady Walker entered, followed closely by Buzzcut and a couple of other familiar faces. Grady's boots echoed loudly as he sauntered in, his expression smug as ever. He stopped near the back wall, arms crossed, flanked by his loyal men. The message was clear. I'm watching you. Langston stepped up to the podium, gripping its edges as the room quieted. Good morning, he began, his deep voice steady but powerful. Thank you all for being here. I came back to Willow Ridge to propose an opportunity. One that could bring jobs, clean energy, and a stronger future to this community. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some curious, others skeptical. I know some of you don't trust me, Langston continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. You see me as an outsider, as someone who left this town behind, but I didn't forget Willow Ridge. I came back because I believe in what's possible here. From the back, Grady's voice interrupted, loud and dripping with sarcasm. You believe in what's possible? Sounds more like a sales pitch to me. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but Langston didn't falter. He looked directly at Grady, his voice unwavering. I'm not here to sell you empty promises, Sheriff. I'm here to speak the truth about this town and what's holding it back. Grady's smirk faltered slightly as the crowd turned its attention to him. Langston held their focus, his voice commanding the room. This town deserves better. Better opportunities, better leadership, and better accountability. For too long, men like Sheriff Walker have abused their power. They've silenced voices, buried the truth, and protected their own interests at the expense of this community. A shocked hush fell over the room. Langston felt the energy shift. The unspoken fear that someone had finally said aloud what everyone knew but dared not speak. Grady stepped forward, his face reddening. You better watch yourself, Reed. You don't know what you're talking about. Langston lifted the folder from the table and held it up for the room to see. Actually, I do. I have the proof. Years of misconduct, reports of excessive force corruption, covered up to protect a man who thinks he's untouchable. Grady's voice boomed across the room. You think you can come here and accuse me of this garbage? You're out of line, Reed. Langston turned to face him, his voice sharp as steel. No, Sheriff. You're the one who's out of line and your time is up. Grady lunged forward, his hand reaching for his belt, but the sound of a phone camera clicking broke the moment. From the side of the room, Mitchell stood holding his phone high, recording everything. Careful, Grady, Mitchell said, his voice calm but edged with warning. A man in your position doesn't want to look like he's got something to hide. The crowd shifted again, murmurs rising. The tension was palpable. For the first time, Grady looked unsure, his eyes darting to the faces around him. Langston turned back to the crowd. This isn't about me, he said. It's about all of you. This is your town, your community, and you deserve to know the truth about the people you trust to protect it. A voice rose from the crowd, one of the older landowners. What proof do you have? Langston held up a page from the folder. Here, this is just one of many reports. Complaints filed by citizens that never saw the light of day. Names redacted, statements erased. You've all seen it happen, and you've all been told to look the other way. The room erupted into whispers. Grady's face darkened, his composure slipping. You're lying, Reed. None of that's true. Langston's gaze was unyielding. Then why are you so afraid of the truth? For a long, charged moment, Grady didn't respond. His silence spoke louder than any denial. Langston turned back to the crowd, his voice steady. Change starts when we stop being afraid. I'm not afraid to stand up to men like Grady Walker, and neither should you be. Grady's fists clenched at his sides, his face mottled with anger, but he said nothing. Around him, the crowd murmured louder, some nodding, others watching the sheriff with wary eyes. Langston stepped back from the podium, his message delivered. The truth was out. Now it was up to the town to decide what came next. Grady's voice cut through the hum of the room, low and venomous. You'll regret this, Reed. You just made a very big mistake. Langston turned to him, meeting his gaze with calm resolve. No, Sheriff. The mistake was thinking I wouldn't fight back. The courthouse parking lot was bathed in the dull glow of overhead streetlights. A crowd had gathered, Locals who had streamed out of the town hall meeting, their whispers echoing through the night like an unsettled breeze. Langston stood near his car, his posture calm but his fists curled tightly at his sides. The storm was about to hit. Sheriff Grady Walker pushed through the onlookers, his boots pounding against the cracked pavement. His face was flushed, and the veins in his neck bulged beneath his reddening skin. He moved like a man who had been cornered, reckless and unpredictable. Behind him trailed two deputies, their gazes flicking nervously between the sheriff and Langston. "Reed!" Grady's voice bellowed across the lot. Heads turned as he stormed toward Langston, the tension crackling like electricity in the humid night air. "You think you can walk into my town, throw around lies and get away with it?" Langston didn't flinch. He straightened his shoulders and looked the sheriff dead in the eye. "I didn't lie, Grady. And you know it." Grady stopped just feet from Langston, his massive frame towering over him. "You think waving around some papers is going to change a damn thing? I've been keeping this town safe for 20 years. Folks here trust me." Langston's voice was steady as steel. "They trust the image you've created, but that ends tonight. I've got the reports, I've got the witnesses. And come morning, the press will have it too." Grady's jaw tightened, and for a second, Langston swore he saw a flicker of fear behind his eyes. It was only for a heartbeat, but it was there, a crack in the facade. Then, like a volcano ready to erupt, Grady lunged forward, jabbing a finger toward Langston's chest. "You don't know a damn thing about this town you left, Reed. Left for the city and forgot where you came from. You're just another outsider who thinks he's better than us." Langston stepped into the space between them, unyielding. "I left because I had to, Grady. Because men like you made sure there was no room for people like me to succeed here. But I came back to fix what's broken, not to be intimidated by a small-town tyrant." Grady's face twisted, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You think you're fixing something? You're the one stirring up trouble, all those reports of mine. You think anyone will believe you when I say you're just out for revenge, just another angry man looking for a fight?" Langston's anger flared, but he kept it in check. "Call it what you want, but the truth is coming, and you won't be able to stop it." Grady's hand inched toward his belt, toward his holstered gun. For a split second, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. Langston saw the deputies behind Grady stiffen, their unease evident, but none of them stepped in. Grady was their superior. Who would dare? "Go ahead," Langston said softly, his tone cutting through the silence like a blade. "Pull that gun, Grady. Show them who you really are." Grady froze, his hand hovering inches above the holster. The crowd murmured, and Langston's words hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. "You've spent your life hiding behind that badge, pretending you're a protector," Langston continued, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "But you're not protecting anyone. You're protecting yourself, your power, your control, and deep down, you're terrified of losing it." "Shut your mouth!" Grady barked, his face purple with rage. Langston took a step closer, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "What are you so afraid of, Grady? That people will finally see you for what you are, a fraud, a coward who hides behind his authority because he knows he'd have nothing without it," Grady snapped. With a roar, he lunged forward, grabbing Langston by the collar and shoving him backward. Langston stumbled against the car, the sharp edge of the door digging into his ribs. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and a woman's voice cried out, "Sheriff, stop!" But Grady wasn't listening. His fists were balled, his chest heaving. "I'll show you who's in charge here." Langston didn't move. He stood tall, his breathing measured, his eyes locked on Grady's. In that moment, he knew he had won. Grady had shown his true colors for everyone to see. The sheriff realized it too. His face flickered with the dawning horror that he had lost control. Langston's voice was low, but clear. "Is this how you serve your town, Grady? By attacking unarmed men in front of witnesses?" Grady released Langston abruptly, his chest still rising and falling with ragged breaths. Around them, phones had emerged. Several members of the crowd had started recording the confrontation. Langston saw Mitchell standing at the edge of the lot, phone raised, his expression grim. "You're done," Langston said, straightening his collar. "And you know it." The sheriff spun around, his gaze darting across the crowd. Faces of people who, for the first time, looked at him with something other than trust or fear. There was doubt in their eyes now. Doubt and disgust. "Y'all don't believe him, do you?" Grady shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "He's lying. He's trying to destroy me." But no one answered. The crowd was silent. Mitchell stepped forward then, his voice calm but firm. "Sheriff Walker, you've assaulted a citizen in front of witnesses and on camera. I suggest you call it a night before you make things worse for yourself." Grady turned to him, trembling with rage. "You're siding with him?" "I'm siding with the law," Mitchell replied coolly. "Something you seem to have forgotten." Grady stood there, fists clenched, his shoulders heaving. For a long moment, it seemed like he might fight back, might do something even worse, but then, slowly, he turned and stormed toward his patrol car, shoving through the crowd without another word. Langston exhaled, his pulse finally slowing. Around him, the crowd began to murmur again, soft, uncertain voices, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Mitchell approached, tucking his phone into his pocket. "That was reckless," Mitchell said, though there was a hint of pride in his tone. "But you backed him into a corner, he won't recover from this." Langston turned to him, his expression resolute. "He'll try, men like him always do, but it's out of his hands now." As if on cue, Langston's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen. Several texts from reporters, all asking for comment. News of Grady's meltdown had already begun spreading. Langston looked back at the crowd, meeting the eyes of people who had watched the sheriff unravel before them. Some looked uncertain, others ashamed, but there were a few who looked at him with something new: respect. "Change is coming," Langston said quietly to Mitchell, and Grady Walker just lit the match. Mitchell nodded. "It's about time." The drive back to the hotel was quiet. Langston's hands rested on the wheel, his thoughts churning. Tonight had been a victory, but the war wasn't over. Grady's allies would close ranks, the council would scramble to protect itself, and tomorrow's headlines would ignite a firestorm. But for the first time, the town had seen the truth. Langston parked and sat in the dark, staring through the windshield. He thought of his mother, who had once told him, "Sometimes you've got to shake the roots to make a tree grow stronger." Willow Ridge was shaking now, and there was no stopping it. His phone buzzed again, another reporter. Another chance to expose the truth. Langston answered. "This is Langston Reed, I have a story for you." The late afternoon sun painted the town of Willow Ridge in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the streets as Langston stood in front of the old courthouse. He hadn't planned to be here, but fate had a way of throwing him into the places where power and injustice met. The air was thick with tension as he waited for Grady Walker to arrive. The sheriff, his old adversary, had called for a final meeting, the one where Langston would either prove himself or be crushed under the weight of the town's systemic corruption. Grady had underestimated him before, but now Langston had the upper hand. The documents, the recordings, the testimonies, all the evidence was in his hands. It was time to take a stand. Grady's patrol car screeched into the parking lot, its tires skidding slightly as it came to a halt. The sheriff stepped out slowly, his usual swagger replaced with a tightness in his posture. The look on his face was a mixture of frustration and something deeper. Fear. Perhaps. He knew his reign was coming to an end. Langston met his gaze. He didn't flinch. He had faced men like Grady before, men who believed their power was untouchable, but Langston had learned the hard way that the truth could bring them down. And today, that truth would be the weapon he wielded. "Reed!" Grady growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're some kind of hero coming here, trying to tear down everything I've built for this town? You're nothing but an outsider, a rich city boy who doesn't know the first thing about what we go through." Langston stood tall, his voice steady but firm. "I know exactly what you go through, Grady. You've spent years hiding behind that badge, pretending to be something you're not. You're not a protector, you're a bully, and I'm here to expose you for the fraud you are." Grady's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Langston saw the anger bubble to the surface. But Grady wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Langston could sense it, and it made him more determined than ever to keep pushing. Grady had kept this town under his thumb for far too long, and Langston wasn't going to let him get away with it any longer. "You think you've got me figured out, huh?" Grady sneered. Well, you don't know a damn thing about me, Reed. You don't know the first thing about the sacrifices I've made for this town, about the things I've had to do to keep it from falling apart." Langston stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I know exactly what you've done, Grady, and I know that you've used your position to line your pockets and hurt the people you were supposed to protect. I have the evidence, I have the witnesses. You're done." Grady's expression faltered for just a second, just long enough for Langston to see it. The doubt. The realization that his power was slipping away. Then Grady's anger flared again, and he took a step closer, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything? You're nothing but a nuisance. You'll never be able to tear down what I've built. This town needs me. Without me, it would crumble." Langston held his ground, every word coming out with deliberate precision. "This town doesn't need you, Grady. It needs someone who will put the people first, not their own selfish desires. You've built your empire on lies, on intimidation, and on fear. But that ends today." The sheriff took another step forward, but this time Langston didn't back down. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do. The crowd had gathered around them, watching in hushed silence. This was the moment that would decide the fate of Willowridge. "Enough talk, Reed," Grady snapped, his voice rising. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you? You think you can just waltz in here and take everything away from me? You think your fancy papers and your big city connections are going to save you when it all comes crashing down?" Langston's jaw tightened, and he stepped forward, his voice now cold and unyielding. "I'm not trying to take anything from you, Grady. I'm trying to give this town the chance it deserves. You've had your chance, and you've blown it. I'm here to make sure you can never hurt anyone again." Grady took another step, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes burning with hatred. "You think you're some kind of hero? Well, here's the truth, Reed. You're nothing. You've always been nothing. Just a kid who got lucky, who thought he could escape the life he was born into. But you'll never be one of us. You'll never belong here." Langston felt the sting of Grady's words, but it didn't rattle him. It didn't make him doubt himself. He had spent years fighting to prove that he belonged, that he was more than the circumstances he was born into. He had worked harder than anyone, fought harder than anyone, to get to where he was. And now, he would fight again, not just for himself, but for the people who had been silenced by men like Grady. "I belong here more than you ever will, Grady," Langston said, his voice low, but filled with an unshakable resolve. "I've earned my place. You, on the other hand, have just taken and taken, leaving nothing but destruction in your wake. But you don't get to control this town anymore. You're done." For a moment, there was silence. Tense, heavy, silence. Langston's words hung in the air like a challenge. And then, Grady's face contorted in rage, his hands clenching into fists. "You think I'm done?" Grady shouted, his voice rising to a terrifying pitch. "You think you can just walk away from this? You don't know who you're messing with, Reed. I'll ruin you." Langston didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't let the sheriff's threat get under his skin. Instead, he stood there, calm and unrelenting. "You already have, Grady," Langston said quietly. "You've ruined yourself." Grady let out a primal roar of frustration, but before he could take another step, one of the deputies, his loyal underling, finally spoke up. His voice was hesitant, but it carried the weight of a decision that had been a long time coming. "Sheriff, we can't keep doing this. Not like this. This town is falling apart because of what we've been letting happen. Maybe it's time we step back." Grady whipped around, his face twisted in fury. "You stay out of this. This is none of your business." But the deputy, his face a mixture of guilt and resolve, didn't back down. "It is my business. It's all our business. We've all seen what's been going on, and we're not going to cover it up anymore." The sheriff's face went pale as the realization set in. His empire of corruption was crumbling. He looked around at the people who had once feared him, who had once turned a blind eye. But now, they were looking at him with contempt. His power was slipping, and he couldn't stop it. Langston turned to the crowd, his voice carrying over the tension. "This town deserves better than Grady Walker. It deserves a future. Not more of the same lies and corruption, and I won't stop until I see it." Grady stood frozen, his chest heaving with anger, but his authority had evaporated. The game was over. The truth had come out. Then, without a word, he turned and stormed off, his deputies trailing behind him, unsure of what to do next. The crowd remained silent, watching as the sheriff retreated into the night. Langston felt the weight of the moment settle over him. It was a victory, but it wasn't over yet. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Langston stayed in place, his heart still pounding. He had won this battle, but the war for Willow Ridge was just beginning. The days that followed the showdown outside the courthouse felt like an emotional whirlwind. Willow Ridge was no longer the sleepy, quiet town Langston had once known. It was a place in transition, at the precipice of change. The sheriff had fled, his badge and authority stripped away. But the ripple effects of that confrontation were only beginning to be felt. Langston knew that the fight wasn't over, that the struggle for justice wasn't as simple as one victory. But in that moment, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The town had seen what happened when one man stood up to a corrupt system, and although Grady Walker was gone, the cracks in the foundation of Willow Ridge's long-standing corruption were visible. And that was just the beginning. The next few weeks were a blur of press conferences, town meetings, and legal action. Grady Walker had tried to flee, but the walls were closing in on him. With the sheriff's sudden departure, other corrupt figures, city council members, local businessmen, and even a few police officers, felt the pressure to distance themselves from him. The fear that had once kept them silent was now replaced by the realization that Langston had the upper hand. Langston's legal team worked tirelessly, following through on the promises he had made to expose the corruption. The mayor, who had been a passive accomplice to Grady's reign, was the first to fall. As Langston presented irrefutable evidence of the mayor's involvement in a string of illegal land deals and shady business ventures, the town's residents were left in shock. One by one, the figures who had been complicit in the corruption crumbled. But the most significant moment of accountability came when Grady himself was arrested. He had tried to escape to a neighboring state, but a carefully planned sting operation, led by Langston's allies in the justice system, caught him before he could vanish for good. When he was brought back to Willow Ridge, shackled and humiliated, it was a symbol of victory, not just for Langston, but for the entire town. In the local paper, the headline read, "Corrupt Sheriff Arrested, a New Era for Willow Ridge." For the first time in years, the town's future felt uncertain, but in the best way possible. Langston had never imagined himself at the center of such a storm. Back in the city, he'd been focused on his career, on building his company, on changing lives through innovation. He had never thought that the fight for justice would pull him back into the small town that had tried to reject him all those years ago. But now, standing in front of the town hall as they prepared to announce a new, more transparent leadership for the sheriff's department, Langston realized how much he had changed. He had learned that true strength didn't always lie in the ability to fight back. Sometimes, it was in the resilience to keep pushing even when the odds were against you. The long nights of strategizing, the meetings with the town's most disenfranchised citizens, the pain of seeing how much injustice had been buried for so long. Every one of those moments had forged a new version of Langston, a version that wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, but for everyone who had suffered under the weight of systemic oppression. "You did it," Mitchell said, stepping up beside Langston with a smile. "The town's different now. It feels different." Langston nodded, his gaze fixed on the sheriff's department building across the street. It was a place that had once represented the worst of Willow Ridge, but now, it would be a place of accountability. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mitch," Langston said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You were the one who spoke out when it mattered. You risked everything to help bring change." Mitchell's grin faded a little as he looked back at the group of townspeople gathered on the courthouse steps. "I'm just glad I didn't let fear keep me quiet anymore. You've made me realize that we all have to stand up. It's not just about one person, it's about all of us." Langston felt the weight of his friend's words. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was the town's fight, and together, they would see it through. With Grady gone and the corrupt mayor now removed from office, the town council was forced to address the systemic issues that had kept Willow Ridge under a veil of silence and fear Langston had worked tirelessly with local leaders, pushing for reform, pushing for a town that valued transparency and equity. His efforts were met with mixed emotions. Some resisted change, holding on to the old ways of doing things, while others, like Mitchell and the town's younger generation, saw it as a necessary step forward. The town's first new sheriff, a woman named Rachel Green, was sworn in 2 weeks after Grady's arrest. Rachel had been one of the few officers in the department who had refused to turn a blind eye to the corruption. She was the embodiment of the change Langston had fought for, a sheriff who would work with the people, not against them. Langston had helped broker the deal that ensured the police department would receive anti-bias training, and the town council had unanimously voted to put more funding toward community outreach programs, especially in the Black and Latino neighborhoods that had long been marginalized. Langston was cautious, but hopeful. He knew that the work wasn't finished. Too much had been buried over the years for change to happen overnight, but the seeds of a new beginning had been planted. People in the town were beginning to talk about reform in a way they never had before. And for the first time in a long time, Langston allowed himself to believe that change was possible. Sitting in his office late one evening, Langston took a moment to reflect on how far he had come. The piles of paperwork, the court cases, the endless meetings, it had all been worth it. But as he leaned back in his chair and gazed out the window, he knew that the journey was far from over. The toll of the fight had been heavy on him. The long nights, the personal attacks, the doubts about whether he was doing the right thing. It had been a test of his spirit, his resolve. But as he thought about the families who had approached him, the people who had found their voices again, he knew that it had all been worth it. Langston had not just fought for justice, he had fought for the future. As he left the office that evening, walking into the crisp night air, he felt something new. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing that, no matter how hard the battle, the fight for justice was never in vain. There was still work to be done, still battles to fight. But Langston Reed had learned one important truth. True strength wasn't about winning every fight. It was about standing up, every single time, no matter the odds. As Langston drove home, he passed the now empty courthouse square. The lights inside flickered on and off, as if reflecting the town's own uncertainty. Uncertainty that was slowly giving way to hope. Langston had helped tear down the walls of corruption in Willow Ridge, but the struggle was far from over. The legal system would still need reform, the town's residents would still need to be educated, their voices amplified. There would still be people who resisted the change, who fought to hold on to the old ways. But Langston knew that he couldn't stop now. This fight had taught him something important. The change he had set into motion was just the beginning. Willow Ridge was only one town, and there were more towns out there like it. Places where corruption ran deep, where prejudice was a daily reality. Langston had found his purpose. He wasn't just fighting for Willow Ridge. He was fighting for every town, every city, where people were silenced, where justice was out of reach. And as he drove off into the night, the road ahead felt wide open.